officer to command the academics sitting by me. But I'm not going to give them a military command to say this or not. We have touched upon the challenges that China and the United States have been confronted with. This session, we are going to touch upon opportunities and challenges for China and US cooperation in global security. We are going to have 3 speakers who will speak from their own perspectives on the opportunities and challenges we are dealing with. And then we have Honorable Stephen Ollins, the chairman of National Committee on US-China National Relations. He will be our discussant. We shall start with Dr. Abraham Sofa, who is so senior at present. Let's give him a big welcome.
You don't mess with a general. Dr. Wu, thank you for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure. And Dr. Nang, you've done an incredible job, as usual. You do everything perfectly. This has been an amazing conference for me. I felt like I was just being fed wonderful meals for the last few hours of information. The cyber panel was, even though I know quite a bit about that field, was really illuminating. And of course, the climate panel was very informative for me. I'm not in that field. I do not have to tell you that I speak for myself personally and not for any organization, because you'll see from my remarks that I step out of line repeatedly with the doctrinal and policy ideas that my country is espousing in the China-U.S. relationship. China and the United States have regularly confirmed that they are determined to avoid the adverse consequences historically observed when a rising power competes with an established great power. This has happened repeatedly. President Xi said at Sunnylands, for example, China and the United States must find a new path, one that is different from the inevitable confrontation and conflict between the major countries in the past. As Ambassador Cui Tiankai said, today, cooperation is underway on many issues, but he also recognized that the notion of win-win diplomacy has made for good press, but nonetheless failed to curb a growing record of differences. Win-win diplomacy, in fact, is fundamentally necessary in the China-U.S. relationship. Its merit lies, though, in what it conveys about the consequences of the alternative strategy of win-lose. The two states have properly disavowed the objective of overcoming each other. But to solve complex differences, they must move beyond rhetoric to effective diplomacy. Competition and national self-interest are inherent aspects of every face-off between a great and a rising power. To pretend otherwise negates the only conceivable basis upon which a win-win strategy could conceivably be fashioned and implemented. Pretense, in fact, is the enemy of good policy. It encourages the illusion that conflicting objectives can be resolved through the affirmation of good intentions. And it also exaggerates the significance of failures. Solutions of the most difficult problems require creative and active diplomatic engagement. I'm going to take 3 or 4 of those and give you examples of what I feel should be done to address those issues. First, the South China Sea. China has made sweeping and, in some respects, untenable claims to the islands, features, and waters of most of the NISCSS. The Philippine complaint against China was intended to force a satisfactory resolution of their differences, but has instead led China to launch a determined effort to foreclose any doubt about its sovereignty. It refused to appear in the Philippine action and is building military bases and other installations on islands and contested reefs while increasing its naval capacities. China has also challenged Vietnam's claims in the NISCSS, and its maritime claims are inconsistent with those of other states, including Japan. China has very substantial interests in asserting its claims. It does not want to give up its historic claims. It feels that it did not agree in UNCLOS to submit those claims to involuntary adjudication, and it feels that it has the power to have its way. The U.S. also has substantial interests in ensuring a peaceful and fair resolution of SCS issues. It has allies and friends in the area. It will inevitably take steps to curb China's effort to overwhelm its neighbors, and will not acquiesce in China dominating critical Asian waterways. The issue for both states is how to secure an acceptable, even if only practical, solution to the crisis. As a former State Department lawyer, the last thing I would have expected to hear from U.S. officials is that this complex set of problems could be solved by an international arbitration to which one party had refused to submit. International adjudication is a potentially effective method for resolving boundary disputes, but it is notoriously ineffective when a necessary party refused to participate. The U.S. has often agreed to arbitrate disputes with other states, but it has refused, we have refused, to participate when we have not given our consent. The U.S. has not yet ratified UNCLOS, but any prospect that it will do so depends on the effectiveness of the same reservations on which China is relying. Supporting the Philippine action has proved ineffective. Instead, the U.S. should consider helping to bring about the withdrawal of the Philippine action and a corresponding moderation of China's response. In doing so, the U.S. should credit China for its record of respecting status quo commitments and resolving border disputes through diplomacy, because it makes sense to encourage China to emphasize those policies rather than overreacting to challenges and leaving disputes unresolved. These positions would enhance U.S. credibility in urging China to modify or suspend claims and actions that alienate its neighbors and to adopt agreements such as the proposed Code of Conduct. On the EEZ issue, the U.S. has insisted on its right under international law to engage in military and intelligence activities in EEZs. China has argued no such right exists. Here, as with the SCS issues, both states seek somehow to establish their positions on the basis of legal issues that are unlikely ever to be resolved. Here, too, the legal arguments distract from the need to shape an effective diplomatic strategy. Both states should consider how to manage this issue more effectively without compromising their principles. The potentially adverse consequences of continuing challenges in the air and ocean are real and will increase if China accepts the U.S. invitation to increase its activities in the U.S. EEZ. Nor will the presence of large numbers of Chinese naval vessels and aircraft along the U.S. coast be well received by the U.S. public. We can handle it, but who needs it? Perhaps the parties could agree on a moderation of U.S. exercise of its rights, consistent with the obligation to take the concerns of coastal states into account, together with de facto Chinese acquiescence. A deliberate move away from confrontation without altering the principles espoused by either state would evidence self-interested diplomacy, not weakness, and could ultimately result in a lower level of Chinese armed activity. Cybersecurity was a wonderful panel today. And the U.S. views China, I think the participants understated the way our press describes what China is doing, as a persistent, damaging source of cyber attacks aimed not only at intelligence gathering and disrupting U.S. national security, but also at the theft of intellectual property and private information. China has condemned U.S. cyber activities and especially objects to efforts to undermine China's controls on internet access and political freedoms. Both states have expressed the willingness to negotiate, but are actually building defensive and offensive cyber capabilities, enhancing the power of their intelligence agencies, and spending heavily to provide defenses for each new level of sophistication in attacks. Now, in 2010, I prepared a report for the National Academy of Sciences on the potential use of international agreements to enhance cybersecurity, along with Dave Clark at MIT and Whitfield Diffie, who invented cyber encryption. We had no illusions about limiting cyber activities related to national security, as we heard earlier today. We argued, though, that the U.S. should work towards developing international security standards for critical infrastructure industries such as finance, civil aviation, energy, and medicine. The U.S., however, opposes working through the ITU or any other international structure to develop cyber standards, regarding such proposals as naive at best. Of course, the distrust between China and the U.S. on this issue is very high, but that is why security standards are needed for important industries, prepared by technicians in a non-political agency and approved by consensus, as is done in such agencies as the IMO. We rejected top-down negotiation and regulation and recommended instead that a group such as the IETF be made into a privately controlled technical committee of the international agency formed or used for this work. This effort looks hopeless now. I'll admit that. But the growing cost and futility of current policies should eventually force both states to restrict cyber confrontation to the national security arena. China may have forced some movement on this issue by announcing plans to insist on cyber-protected equipment for its financial sector, but deferring implementation at the U.S. request. What is the U.S. going to suggest? That's interesting. Are we going to say, well, keep deferring? Is it going to be another humiliating situation like the bank? Or are we going to come up with something constructive that develops some plan that advances mutual interests and actually secures financial institutions worldwide? Finally, infrastructure development. This is an additional example of dysfunctional diplomacy. China has created the AIIB after a group of 20 leading economies agreed some 5 years ago to reduce their outsized authority at the IMF, but Congress failed to act and approve the changes. So China went ahead, formed the bank, inviting both Asian and non-Asian states to join. Instead of responding constructively to this proposal, blaming Congress, as they should have, for this blockage of progress, and blessing the process and at least accepting it and providing the criticisms that were appropriate, the U.S. suggested that no one join and urged its allies in particular not to join. These requests were disregarded, and the administration did serious harm to U.S. credibility by adopting that blocking strategy sending a clear message to China that it does not want China to establish any kind of independent financial role. So let me conclude by saying what these elements teach me, at least. Going beyond win-win rhetoric means more than simply recognizing that win-lose diplomacy will have lose-lose results. It's really a reality. China and the U.S. must face, however, the reality that their commitment not to win strategically is not a promise to refrain from competing. Effective diplomacy, however, requires more than outmaneuvering one another on short-term objectives. China has increased its wealth, power, and influence not through unilateral implementation of claims, but as a result of policies carefully put in place by its modern leadership based on peaceful, patient, intentionally international-oriented political and economic activities. Neither China nor the U.S. should underestimate, moreover, the inevitably sobering impact on China of its own excesses. China's actions in the NISCSS, for example, have generated collective plans and responses among its neighboring states that would otherwise have been inconceivable. Its increase of naval power will be offset by the combined forces of its anxious neighbors, aided by the U.S. Its economic advancement will suffer setbacks, both at home and abroad, which it should be prepared to absorb. China needs practical solutions that conserve its resources and increase its influence. States have rights, but neither guaranteed nor lasting greatness is among them. National greatness is earned. And in today's world, nuclear weapons, economic interdependence, winning can only be understood to connote leadership and achievement, not triumph. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I forgot to remind speakers that you will limit your presentation to 10 minutes, please. Now, Dr. Sinting Lee.
I got away with it.
Yeah, exactly.
You're the only exception.
Goes to President Wu and President Oren for your kind invitation. Talking about security cooperation, opportunity, challenges, and recommendation. Opportunities are plentiful, mainly in non-traditional security area, not to exclude traditional security area. Traditional security area, stopping through China-U.S. joint effort, DPRK's pursuit of nuclear weapon, and Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapon. We are almost there to stop Iran, but we need to work harder for another 2 or 3 months to make a full framework. Since we're able to cooperate on Iran, that should energize our effort to stop North Korea in a realistic way. To revert might be very difficult, but to freeze, not to increase its capability, might still be possible. Why Iran is willing to cooperate? Because it is still offered even a very limited opportunity to build a nuclear weapon after a decade. So Iran does not need to make a breakthrough now, but it is legally allowed to do it with a quick breach. That's how Iran is willing to make compromise if US and EU would withdraw their sanctions. To ask North Korea to abandon in a verifiable way completely its nuclear well vessel is very difficult. but to prevent it from building up its nuclear weapon capability in a trustful way might not be impossible. So I would hope our two countries would work together further on this. Non-traditional area climate change, as many panelists have mentioned, that in later part of this year, COP21, that entails China-US great cooperation to bring India into the rope. Then we would give great footprint for President Obama's presidency, and to give Hillary Clinton a very big policy legacy for her to carry on. And this would give China-US confidence in the non-traditional security area to cooperate. Anti-pirating. We are continue to crack down on such a non-traditional threat wherever, when they emerge. Somalia or other place, we have been doing very well, and that phenomenon is receding. Anti-terror. The US GI may withdraw largely from Afghanistan this year. Someone need to step in to fill the power vacuum. It has to be an international force, best UN peacekeeping force. China has a stake and can help, but how our two countries could address this in a constructive way to entice both to play a role. That's a fresh new area to cooperate. Containing pandemics, dealing with Ebola, the two armed forces send their men and women to Africa in parallel. But they can do better to make a joint command, to work together shoulder by shoulder, a Chinese hospital with a US medical team and a UN facility with Chinese and American military medical resource. We can contemplate about this and to make it possible at a future operation. Challenges are ever rising. Commercial cyber security. For security cyber business, strategic military intelligence, we can never stop it. Sun Tzu has said we need to understand each other and we need to steal the defense intelligence. That's what a government is meant. It is built to steal. But the USA, this is understandable, as Edward Snowden has reviewed. US is doing this a lot. But US is charging others, including China, to conduct commercial cyber stealing. First, it's a phenomenon. China claims itself as a major victim, but China never say US government has instigated this. US government suspects that Chinese government is behind it. Chinese government says, no, I don't have internet armed force, so I have no man to do it. But the Chinese government never deny there may be individual Chinese, a company, an NGO in China, or someone outside of China manipulating Chinese infrastructure to hack on the US. To me, this ushers a great opportunity for our two countries to work. Since Chinese government say, I'm not doing it, and I'm against to do so, why not the US government present evidence so China-US could stage joint investigation in China if a certain Chinese entity might have be involved. And Chinese government may present credible evidence so US-Chinese government could launch a joint investigation inside the US. We should not only say, no, I have not done it. We should say, yes, welcome to my country. I would open some of my facility and the records for you to investigate, to build up our confidence. And maritime, as we have discussed this morning, we are accustomed to say, I have a right to do so. We have not built a culture. How we would work together to reduce the source of tension. South China Sea. Chinese argument is that all these isles, the rock feature are mine, as I used to occupy them, as I declared them latest 1948, and other neighboring countries, it took my sovereign things, and against their own tacit admission or clear agreement that these belong to China. So why the US would say, after 2002 DOC making, we should not create a new change of status quo. But the prior establishment of the change of status quo by 1948 is doable. China has its own argument. To me, it's very unlikely China would resort to military means to take over those rocks. But that does not mean China cannot sue other claimants for their change of status quo prior to 2002. But with China's joining of UNCLOS, which was made in 1982, China might be viewed as vulnerable by many for conducting economic activity in the overlapped area between China's place defined by U-shaped line and others EEZ. But if China would occupy all such island, many of those islands would be able to claim the island-based EEZ. And that would still give tremendous amount of rights to China per UNCLOS. And this give rich opportunity for China and other claimants to balance their interests, to play the give and take game. Economic security. China considers that the TPP is great, but too good for me to do right now. Probably 15 years later, that's my dish. China used to consider that the WTO posed threat to China. And the US was eager to bring China on the boat of WTO. But 10 years after joining WTO, China has been the biggest, China has reaped a tremendous amount of benefit from it. Probably US lose more, relatively. But actually both win. China wins far more. China may not know that if I would change my domestic behavior to match the condition of TPP, I lose for 5 years. And then I would catch up with the industrialized economy to be far more competent than it is now. So China needs to balance. The balance is bilateral, various bilateral FTA and the FTAAP proposal. So we compete, and eventually, through competition, China would much narrow its distance with the US. So I would view such a competition not necessarily adverse. If we conduct them in a healthy way, that may healthily, positively promote China's competence that the US would respect. Finally, the US has just announced not to sell, to conduct export control on China's supercomputer, super calculation facility. For a while, China's further upgrading of the Tianhe second to third might meet a certain difficulty. But history tells us when the US denied China's access to GPS in 1997, when China launched the missile, empty warhead missile to course the force in Taiwan, which inclines to independence. China was hurt. We were not able to access to GPS signal. But 18 years later, we have our own Beidou satellite installation in the sky. 18 years. US has had a various export control embargo on China. 10 years, 20 years later, China would have them one by one. So this time, if the US would view China's build-up of its own supercomputing capability pose a threat to American national security, America would most likely press China to build its own competent chip capability in 10, 15 years, or shorter. That would fundamentally threat America. A smart idea is to keep selling this to China with a condition. If China would use such chips to build its computer, US would have a right to demand that these would only be used for civilian purpose, not to use the name peaceful purpose. As China can claim its own military activity is for peaceful purpose. US can say civilian purpose. So if China would simulate its nuclear weapon explosion through such a computer with US chip, it's not expected. US would have a right to inspect or to monitor. So this, in my view, might be a better relationship. It's a regulated relationship. China would use US input for betting its own people's life, but not to bet its own armed force, which may have a utility on handling East Asian security relationship, and America may be unhappy with. And China has launched its own new plan to modernize its chip industry. I was invited to America last year to talk to its chip company, what China may do, how this would help China, and how US may be prepared. So all this would happen. China has a huge amount of human resource, financial resource, and leadership competence. Simply denying China would only bring US short-term benefit, and that does not promote the trust and cooperation. But the US has its legitimate security interest to protect, and China should respect American legitimate interest. Should not buy the US chip to build our own computer, to build our nuclear weapon to counter America. But if China would fail to do, US would have a right to deny. But to deny, there is an adverse strategic technology competition. China eventually would excel. So why we would be involved in a negative competition? We should understand each other and respect each other and welcome a healthy competition. That would may be able to build the so-called new type of major country relationship. China is a major country. China would depend upon its own intelligence, its own human mind to build up. But the US can help by educating Chinese PhD and all students in America every year. That's a huge US cooperation with China. But given this, China still needs to respect Americans' current role in the world, which is largely positive. But in many important aspects, China feels that China's own legitimate major country rights, including national security and sovereignty rights, are not respected. So these are bits of my source, how I feel in the decade ahead, China-US security competition and the challenges, as well as ample opportunities lie, and how I would offer my humble idea that we should be able to work together to overcome many of these difficulties. Thank you very much.
General Chen, I'll see if I can do a little better. President Wu, I very much appreciate the opportunity to be speaking here at this important inaugural event. And since I will acknowledge that this concluding panel is the only thing that stands between us and drinks, I will try to expedite that process. So I'll be brief. The agenda of this meeting, obviously, as others have noted, has highlighted some of the major challenges and potentially disruptive factors that are confronting the international system. Not surprisingly, the United States and China are at the forefront of these issues. Our two countries are destined to be the world's most powerful states for decades to come. Both, therefore, will play central roles in refashioning the international order in the 21st century. But what kind of an order do our countries seek? Are our respective views compatible with one another? To what extent can we collaborate on shared goals? And can the areas of policy divergence be narrowed or at least effectively managed? Issues of this magnitude will obviously dominate strategic discussions for many, many years to come. And at least if one is to judge by the kind of ferocious academic and policy debate in both of our countries, there seems to be very little concurrence and consensus on them. President Obama and President Xi, of course, have repeatedly met and have communicated both by letters and by phone, seeking to provide each other assurance about strategic goals for both countries. And there's no need for me to revisit those. We're familiar with what many of those words are. But assurances of benign intent, although no doubt welcome, are demonstrably insufficient. The global system as we see it is on the cusp of profound change, and both countries are grappling with enormous internal economic, societal, and political challenges, and in some cases, contradictions. I'm reminded that Herman Kahn once said that all cliches contain a lot of truth, and I just pronounced a cliche, but it's true. The world as we see it today does not conform to many of the realities with which we were familiar in the 20th century. So the question is, what happens next? President Obama's remaining tenure in office will be much briefer than President Xi's, so he will bequeath many issues to whoever succeeds him in the White House in another 21 months. This does not make him a lame duck, and it would be a profound misjudgment to write off the remainder of his presidency, especially in terms of foreign policy, where he has much more latitude than in domestic affairs. And we need only look at the examples of Cuba and, of course, the persistent attention to Iran to illustrate that. But as always, we want to know what political leaders do with the time that they have. For President Obama, Asia and the Pacific and the U.S. regional role is central to his foreign policy legacy. Unlike the greater Middle East, Southwest Asia, and now increasingly Central Europe, Asia and the Pacific remains, on the whole, prosperous, stable, and at peace. Both presidents say they want to keep it that way. And as Dr. Kissinger reminded us this morning, whether or not the United States and China can work toward the avoidance of overt conflict will tell us a lot about the century into which we are headed. Competition, as Abe has reminded us, is not a bad word. Shunding Li said very much the same. There's something called healthy competition, and I agree fully. The question is whether or not we can avoid in that process clashes of interest that lead us down paths we don't want to pursue. But without mutual awareness of consequences, without mutual restraint, and without mutual respect, if you will, mutual legitimation, the larger aspirations of our political leaders will fall short and will lead to a much less congenial international future. If we think of U.S.-China relations, it does seem to me our futures are, of course, hugely intertwined. We are joined at the hip, less so at the head, and decidedly not at the heart. So those are the challenges, it seems to me, that apply. And there are differences here. Very, very struck by how our two presidents look at the Pacific and treat it very, very differently. President Xi, of course, at Sunnylands and on other occasions, has said, well, you know, the Pacific is big enough, it's a huge ocean, there's room for both of us. When President Obama spoke in Brisbane last November, he quoted a local writer who talked about the Pacific as a lake, not as an ocean, something that in effect said distances really don't matter anymore. So that's a very, very interesting divergence in perspective. So, you know, both presidents have aspirations to no conflict, shared goals, durable cooperation, but it's easier said than done. I'm going to quote an unlikely source here, but maybe it was prompted by this week. It's the 150th anniversary this week of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which was perhaps as traumatic an event as has ever occurred in American history. Let me quote Abraham Lincoln in his message to the Congress, December 1st, 1862. He said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty. As our case is new, we must therefore think anew and act anew, and we must disenthrall ourselves." I offer these words in the hopes that they will caution both of our leaders from being overly presumptuous about the global and regional future and their ability individually to control events. We have shared responsibilities for the future, and it requires a recognition that our two countries cannot do it alone, but without meaningful cooperation, the larger aspirations that both of our leaders have identified cannot possibly be achieved. Thank you.